feels funny to be some distance from you down there, but I think for the sake of hearing well, I'll take advantage of the mic and hope that will feel okay to all of you. It's an honor to be here. For me, like you, I feel like I'm an alumni of Elmira College. Just on the work-a-day side of things, I'm an alumni, and I haven't been back in this particular space in a long time. So maybe I'm feeling some similar feelings that some of you are feeling as you come back. And yeah, Elmira College did great things for me in my little career, and I'm grateful to it. Maybe you feel the same way about the college too. Hope so. So I sort of divided this presentation into two parts. Part one will just be sort of general background, and I don't know if when you attended Elmira College they talked about Mark Twain at all, or his wife, or gave you any background. I know by the time I worked here it was sort of mandated that you were going to learn about Mark Twain whether you liked it or not. So I don't, as I said, I don't know what period you fall into, but maybe this will be a refresher, and maybe it won't be a refresher, depending on what years you're at EC. I chose the title for this lecture because it seemed like it was nice and inflammatory, right? It might get your attention and think, oh, was she really for women's rights? So we'll get to the source of that quote a little later. So we're going to just kind of nod to one another. So next slide. We're going to team up here. So how do we even have this long relationship with Mark Twain? Of course, it begins with Olivia's father, Jervis Langdon. There he is. He's the future father-in-law of Samuel Clemens. And wait, did you go? Okay, well, that's okay. We already moved to the next slide. So Jervis Langdon grew up in the area, married, and was, I guess, a sort of ambitious businessman in the area. He started out in Millport, which is maybe 20 minutes north of here, and ran a little shop, a mercantile as they called it, and it was near to the place where the Chemung Canal was starting to be constructed. So you got to go back to that period of canals as sources of transportation, right? So Olivia is not yet born. In fact, Olivia Senior and Jervis are childless at this point when he's up in Millport. And he's watching the beginning of the canal being built from his shop, and he decides he's going to start to invest in lumber. And then he invests in coal, and by then he's doing very well. I mean, those are two pretty solid commodities to invest in this region, right? And then eventually he even gets involved in railroading. And it's this point that he moves down to Elmira and starts to become an important person in this community where the college would be located. By all accounts, Jervis Langdon was really a fine person. I mean, he obviously had great business sense, right? But he also had a great sense of humanity and the goodness of humanity. He had a kind of a passionate feeling for equality. He was an abolitionist. He helped found the Park Church with his wealth, and you probably know that church was founded on abolitionist creed, right? The minister, Thomas K. Beecher, his sort of mantra was, his creed was just to do good, you know, not to espouse any particular doctrine, but to do good. And Jervis was attracted to that kind of generous impulse also, so helped found the Park Church with his new wealth. And then, of course, there was this talk of establishing a female college here in the city of Elmira. And he was all in for that, too. By then, he had a couple of daughters. And so probably his interest was partially as a parent, wanting the best for his daughters, but also just for women in general, right? So when you look at Coles Hall, you want to know that it was Olivia's father, Mark Twain's father-in-law, that really funded the construction of this building hugely and backed the idea of education for women. Pretty cool. Next slide, please. So back in the day when I was here, and the person who was the director prior to me, Gretchen Charlo, she got a lot of flack because, we were saying that Olivia was a student at Elmira College, and, we needed something to prove that, right? So scouring back through the records, Mark Woodhouse, who was the archivist at the time, found this sort of significant record of Olivia's official enrollment. So she's line 85 there, but she's not technically in Elmira Female College at this point. She's in the feeder program, the preparatory program. So she's a younger girl at this point in time. And so they just kind of advanced forward and did the math and figured if she had enrolled in Elmira College, she would have been a member of the class of 1864. She never graduated. She didn't follow your good examples. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. So that's a nice, legitimate record of her on an official college roster, at least on the preparatory roster. So this one, I had the really good fortune of discovering because, again, people were still kind of teasing me and saying, she wasn't really in the college. She didn't really attend here. And I had a chance to go out to the Mark Twain papers in Berkeley and just was literally rummaging through papers out there, as you sometimes do, looking for things connected with Elmira. And first time I came across this letter, which this is just one page of it. But it was so cool because, of course, this is Mark Twain's handwriting. If you're into Mark Twain Studies, you instantly know that this is him writing this letter. Even if you didn't have the front page and the back page, you would know it's Mark Twain's handwriting without a doubt. And here he's writing to an author friend in Germany, a man named Rudolf Lindau, who over many years they had corresponded back and forth and had a friendship. Lindau was an author. Clemens was an author, so that was part of the friendship. And in this letter, Clemens is responding to a book that Lindau had just written called The Philosopher's Pendulum. Never made a bestseller. But Clemens, of course, had read the book, and he was struck at the similarities because Lindau had set the book in Elmira, New York. And some of the plot line and the main characters were amazingly similar to Olivia's family. There were similarities to the father, to Olivia's brother, and Clemens was just kind of teasing with him and enjoying the similarities. So here we have this wonderful page in the letter where he's saying to Lindau of his book, "The town is right, Elmira. My wife, Olivia Langdon, was born and reared there." And then, ta-da, the college is right. She was a student at Elmira College. How about that? Again, not a graduate, not an alum, but a student at Elmira College. And then he mentions a few other things that were, again, similarities between the book and Olivia's family, which were kind of cool to read. So, okay, next slide. Thank you. So sometimes I have a blank in there, but which is fine. It's just a signal to me to move my thought to a different direction. You don't have to think about it, but I do. So let's go. I'm ready to change my train of thought now. So again, that's just sort of general background about Olivia's involvement with the college and her family's involvement with the college. Now I just want to segue to letters in general, right? So Olivia was a letter writer, as many people in her century were, right? There's over 600 letters in the collection that I had the incredible privilege of working with, unexpected privilege of working with. And the book really only includes about 275 of them. And it's a pretty fat book, So 600 letters would have made it an unmanageable book, right? But this is her earliest letter. This is the first page of her earliest letter, written on March 13th, 1864. So she was born in 1845. So I know you guys can do the math. She's 19 at this time. And she had sickness in her adolescent time period. You might have heard of that. She was often described as a frail woman by biographers, even by Clemens himself. And the root of this frailty is sort of muddy, you know. We have some sense of why and some sense we're not so sure why. So the things that we are sure about come from Mark Twain's autobiography, when he looks back at his wife and he comments that she had a fall on the ice in her mid-adolescence, probably here in Elmira somewhere. She was skating and fell on the ice. And apparently the fall was significant enough that it messed with her spine. And she actually spent several years bedridden in a care facility, sort of a rehabilitation facility in Manhattan, in New York City. I mean, her parents were wealthy enough that they could send her to the best place to help restore this injury that happened to her back. So, I mean, that's one take on it, right? That she fell and injured her back. Another Twain scholar just did a lot more research into the facility that she was in and suggests that maybe, you know, in addition or alongside or instead of that theory, maybe she had something called Pott's disease, which was sort of a degrading back disease that did need treatment and bracing, you know, to sort of get out of that semi-paralysis, right? So again, that's another theory, that maybe that caused this long period of being bedridden. And then another Mark Twain scholar, who is also a pretty renowned physician, has suggested that, well, in this period, you know, 19th century, women of means, especially, right, who were from wealthy families, sometimes just had this period of like general malaise, you know, where it was sort of cool and stylish to be bedridden and weak and frail and cared for. And adolescence, you know, comes with all of its chemical changes and menstrual changes in that century. I'm not quite sure how to deal with all of that. So, you know, he posits that maybe that was part of what was going on too. So, you know, the long of it is all of those theories. The short of it is that we really don't quite know, but we do know without a doubt that she was in New York City for 2 years and then came home, went back again for a second stay of almost 6 months. And finally, the crazy thing that Clemens records, again in his autobiography, it seems like the final grand hurrah that got her up out of her bed and walking was a faith healer came to Elmira, recommended by a relative of the Langdon family. And he basically, you know, said, take up thy bed and walk, kind of a thing, you know. And for whatever reason, that, and in addition to all these other treatments, seemed to work, you know. And Olivia was no longer bedridden. She was up and at 'em. She did have periods of weakness again. See, she's 19 here. So, you know, you got to think of that period from 17 to 19 into 20 as being this time period of, you know, real malaise and back problems. I love to point out this letter. Could we go to the next slide now? Because I think this is a little darker, so maybe it's easier for you to see. But you might notice those straight lines, right? Just sort of scattered throughout the letter. I hope you can see those. So at the end of the letter, over here, she says, I'm going to read it to you. It is trying, straight line, just as I get to writing, straight line, to have hand, arms, shoulders, straight line, and back, give out, and have to, straight line, stop. The straight lines are where, straight line, I rested. So that's indicative, right, of how weak she really was. There, she's telling you in her own language that mom, and that's a letter to her mother, I should have said that. And that's the explanation why those lines are there, because she stopped and rested. So, okay, next one, I think. So once she gets out of that period of time, she comes back to Elmira. It's probably 1866, 67. And we do know she's taking classes at Elmira College, again, at that period in time. I've read an account that says that she attended in Coles Hall, but that's only one, and I don't know if that meant that she was actually housed there. I mean, you know, her home was just down the block from the college, so I can't say that, at least in my research, I've seen that she had a room in Coles Hall. Next slide, please. But in her letters, this is again in 1867, she talks about the college. This is just one line that I grabbed for the presentation today. She mentions to her good friend, she's writing a letter to her friend in Hartford, cousin Lizzie is here and will be until after the college commencement, which she wrote the letter on the 17th, and that year the commencement was on June 27th. Later even than what we had been doing for years. Okay, next slide, please. And of course, here's the Langdon Mansion. So this was the house that Olivia came home to after she would spend the time in the care facilities. This is where the faith healer showed up, and you know, things started to work better for her then. And that fence, of course, is the fence that runs along College Avenue. And you probably know they tore the house down. It's no longer there. And that's where Langdon Plaza now is, down there by the Park Church. I don't know if you know all of that. But that's Olivia's home. She didn't spend her entire childhood there. I think she was about 7 or 8 when the family moved into that home. And it was torn down during the Depression era. But that's another side story. Okay, next one, please. So during this time period, 1866-67, we know without a doubt that she was taking some classes in her home. She loved this Professor Darius Ford. He was the professor of science. Okay, next one, please. And she writes about studying with him, and again in a letter to her good friend Alice Hooker in Hartford, she says, I've commenced studying natural philosophy with Professor Ford and French with the nuns. There is still a convent in Elmira, but back in the day, they were actually teaching and educating in the town, in the city. So I enjoy both very much. Professor Ford is as delightful a teacher as ever. I expect to finish natural philosophy this winter. So now we see it's 1868. Next one, please. Okay, I got to think. Okay, so how does Olivia meet Samuel Clemens? You might know this story, so again, it'll be a quick review. But she actually meets him through her younger brother, Charles Langdon. There were 3 kids in the Langdon family. Susan Langdon Crane, she was an adopted daughter. Parents didn't have children for quite a while, and they learned of a family whose parents both had died from, I think, I don't know, I can't remember right now what they died from, but they left 4 children behind. And Olivia's parents had no children yet, so they adopted Susan, and that was Olivia's older sister, Susan Langdon Crane. Then Olivia was born, and followed by her younger brother, Charles. Charles also took some lessons from Elmira College professors. At this time, he's 17 years old in 1867, and Olivia is 22. All righty. Next one, please. Olivia's mom and dad decide that they're going to send Charlie on a semester abroad experience, the 17-year-old son. He's not doing that great in his studies, and some letters I've read suggest that he had some attractions with women in the city, and so some of us surmise maybe that was part of what the parents were thinking too. Let's send him abroad, let him experience Europe and the Holy Land, and hopefully that will mature him and resettle his mind and make him a man of the world, right? So off he goes. Next slide, please, on the Quaker City steamer. That actually had been a warship in the Civil War, the Quaker City, but they re-outfitted it to be a cruise ship now in 1867. Nice, peaceful reuse of a former battleship. And this was the first cruise occurring. So it was a really big deal in that time period, right? To think about having the privilege of sailing across the ocean, seeing Europe and the Holy Land, right? So as I said, with the best of intentions, Mr. and Mrs. Langdon signed Charles up with the hope that he'll have a good experience. But who does Charles end up hanging out with but this wild humorist from the Pacific Slope who calls himself Mark Twain, who also happens to have gotten a ticket on the Quaker City steamer. His assignment on the ship is quite different than Charles's. His assignment is to send back accounts of the trip to his newspaper in California called the California Alta. And he convinced the Alta to pay his ticket for this 6-month cruise, which was $1,200, which was a lot of money back then. A lot of money, So, but Charles writes home and tells his family that he is taking his meals with one of the men on the ship. He's chosen to sit at his table because at Mark Twain's table, people are always laughing. So they become pretty good buds. This is 1867, so Samuel Clemens is 32, and Charles is 17, so 15 years difference between the two of them. Maybe Clemens takes him under his wing a little bit, and maybe Charles pays for, it seems clear that Charles pays for some of the things that need to be paid for as far as excursions, and we kind of guess maybe Clemens is eyeing him thinking, this kid's pretty well off. No real record of that, but that's something we can sort of surmise. So next slide. So there's a moment when the boat is docked off the Bay of Smyrna. This is still the Quaker City, but it's in calmer waters here. Next slide, please. And Charles shows Samuel a picture of his older sister, Olivia, who's, of course, back here in Elmira in 1867, attending classes with Darius Ford. We don't know what picture he showed her. This is one that I doubt it is it, but it's in an oval miniature frame, so could we go to the next slide? So Clemens, in his autobiography, years hence, right, after he has met Olivia, he records this moment when he saw the picture for the first time. And he says, I saw her first in the form of an ivory miniature in her brother Charlie's stateroom in the steamer Quaker City in the Bay of Smyrna in the summer of 1867 when she was in her 22nd year. Next slide, please. I saw her in the flesh for the first time in New York in the following December, so December of 1867. She was slender and beautiful and girlish, and she was both girl and woman. She remained both girl and woman to the last day of her life. Okay, next slide, please. There's a big, long courtship, and we don't have the time to get into that. That's a long, very entertaining story, especially as Mark Twain tells it in his autobiography, with a lot of embellishments. But they are engaged, finally, on February 4th, 1869. So they met in the flesh December of 1867. So a little more than a year till they officially become engaged. And a lot of letter writing takes place between the two of them in those 14 months. Clemens writes, I think, 180, I'm having a memory lapse, but 180 something letters. And Olivia very carefully saved his letters and numbered them, docketed them, as they say, and treasured his letters to her. She, of course, responded, but later in life, after she passed away, her letters were destroyed, taken away by her daughter, who really was making an effort to protect the privacy of her mother by doing that. We have only one letter written by Olivia from this courtship period, as compared with this 180 some odd letters by Samuel Clemens. So next slide, please. But Olivia does write to her friend in Connecticut, Alice Hooker Day, and has this beautiful statement. This is 1869, so just a couple of weeks after the official engagement, right, in February. And she writes Alice to tell her, "Then I have little to tell you, except that a great, satisfying love has slowly, gradually worked its way into my heart, into my entire being." That's a pretty nice statement, right? Glad we have that letter. Okay, next one, please. Okay, next one. All right, so they marry on February 2nd, 1870. That's just about a year after the engagement occurs. And during that time period, more of these letters go back and forth very, very frequently. And Clemens is over the top in love with Olivia. And if you ever do have an opportunity to read his love letters, you'll just be astounded by his language and his love for Olivia. Also during that time, he's working on The Innocents Abroad, which is his first published book, and it's a runaway bestseller. And it actually is the account of the Quaker City steamer trip. So he does, honor the Alta California and send travel accounts to them, but then he also compiles it in this first book, The Innocents Abroad. And so I think all of that was probably very reassuring to Olivia's parents to see that this guy who they did not know at all, right, who showed up here in Elmira from parts west and was not like anything they had ever seen in the city of Elmira before, nor did he sound like a local New Yorker. And came in and sort of swept their middle daughter off her feet. So to think that he was looking very good to be a successful author, I'm sure reassured them. And he was Mark Twain already at this point. He had published The Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, which you probably have studied at some point in your life. And so he had a name already. But there was an element of risk pretty on the part of the Langdons to embrace Clemens, and eventually they did thoroughly embrace him. All righty, I think we can go to the next slide. They marry, as we just said, in February of 1870, and you may already know that Jervis and Olivia, the parents, give the newlyweds a remarkable wedding gift. This house, fully paid for, with some servants and fully furnished in Buffalo, New York, on one of Buffalo's most fashionable streets in the day. Clemens had borrowed some money from his father-in-law and was a third owner in the Buffalo Express, a newspaper in Buffalo. And now, to his utter surprise, he learns that he is the owner of this beautiful home, a gift home, from his in-laws. We'll go to the next slide. There they are. That's Olivia's mom on the left, and of course, Jervis Langdon, we've already seen on the right. And next slide, please. And here's Olivia writing to her mother, February 16th, so just 2 weeks, she's a newlywed still, 2 weeks into the marriage. She says, 2 weeks tonight we were married. It all seems like a dream. It seems as if we must be playing keep house. But I assure you that we are thankful that we do not have to board. Dear good Father, how happy he has made us by his great, magnificent gift to us. And surely it was a great, magnificent gift. And there's a wonderful pair of letters that are really fun to read. One of Clemens's first letters written in this house to his friend, and then Olivia's early letters to her parents. They're both writing these letters on the same day in different rooms in this house as brand new husband and wife, And it's a pretty amazing pairing of letters to feel their joy, Next one, please. She writes to her mother here, we are as happy as two mortals can well be. And Clemens describes himself as little Sammy in fairyland in a letter he writes to one of his friends because, they just are really blissfully happy and safe and warm and secure. You know, and for Clemens, this is an unbelievable gift because he's had a pretty rough and rocky time in life, you know. So it's a mighty fine start. Okay, next slide. Okay, next one. So now we'll shift from all of that background information. We've got them married and they're on their way. And I thought for the next part, we just sort of be focused on her letters, you know, so you can hear her voice, not mine. That's the point of this. So here, these are just a couple of quotes about writing letters, which are sort of interest, right? This is Olivia talking about writing letters to, again, her good friend Alice Hooker Day in Hartford. She says, "Writing is such a slow medium, is such a cold, inexpressive way. I cannot talk with my pen." I love that because it just seems to be in such contradiction to her husband, who of course is one of our greatest authors, right? Who I don't think he would feel that way necessarily. He would hope he was doing better than that. But for Olivia, the business of writing was a bit of a struggle, you know. Next one, please. To her older sister, Susan Langdon Crane, who we talked about, the adopted older daughter. This is also a really painful one for me to read, personally. She says, "Sue, dear, I cannot endure the idea of my letters traveling around. It is exceedingly distasteful to think of anyone else seeing them." If I ever meet this woman, I know I'm in deep trouble. But hopefully she'll understand. But that's a really important one to digest in your mind because it does then just sort of, in my mind at least, underscore the value and the gift of having her letters available, you know. She was a sort of a private person. She didn't really want her letters around. She destroyed the letters she wrote to her betrothed, right? So the fact that we have the privilege of reading these at all is a nice, mighty nice thing. Okay, thanks. Another one. And this I wanted to show you is her handwriting through most of her letters. I showed you that early letter when she's writing in bed and she's so weak, struggling. It's very faint, and but she has a pretty strident sort of a penmanship, and you might be interested to know that many of her early letters she wrote in purple ink. We won't go there, no. But I just wanted you to get a sense of her handwriting. She underlines, she crosses out. She's not the best speller in the world. Yep, next one, I guess. All righty. So I'm gonna read to you for a little while. I hope you won't fall asleep, but that's the way it is, folks. What time are we at now? I don't know. 2:36, okay. So I'll just be sort of selective since I don't have a way of knowing what time it is. It makes me nervous. I don't want to go too long. When are we supposed to end? 3? All right. You're going to have to shout or something. Okay, so just to give you a sense of the newlyweds, the voice of the joyful Olivia Langdon, I chose some excerpts that are really inserts. So you can imagine she writes a whole letter, right? And all in her handwriting, and then Clemens will come along and insert things in the letter. And there's just kind of this playfulness that goes back and forth between the two of them, like, you know, repartee back and forth. So I'm going to try and give you a sense of that. Samuel writes in, sort of in her letter, in between the lines, "But there is no romance in this existence for Livy." And Olivia crosses out and says, "False." You know, she kind of counters that to his statement that there's no romance in this existence for Livy. "False," she says. Then Samuel says, "We've been married 11 days, and not 35 cross words have passed between us." And Olivia inserts, "Not one." Following the close of the letter, then Olivia adds a bunch of paragraphs, and, you know, she's kind of writing seriously. But of course, Clemens comes along at the end and starts this interchange back and forth again. And they assigned the letter S and L after each of these comments back and forth, so you kind of know who's writing what, as if you can't tell by the handwriting, which of course you can. But so Samuel says, the parentheses refers to the manner of erasing words, not to Allie, S. And then Olivia writes, how thankful I am that you have someone to interpret my letters for you. Samuel says, it is a sort of grammar that renders interpretation very necessary. That's of his wife. Olivia says, I don't think so, because, in capital letters. Then Samuel says, and I do think so, for the same reason. No, L. Go to bed, woman, S. I am not sleepy, L. This it is to be married, S. Yes, indeed, woe is me. This it is to be married, L. Go on, jaw, 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 S. I don't think so, L. Well, take the last word, S. I hope that was understandable, but it's really pretty delightful, and there's a lot of this going on in those early letters. It just, underscores the joy, right? The happiness that they're having together. She says to her friend, Mr. Clemens and I are fully convinced that we are the two happiest people in the world. And that title of the talk, I Deny It, I Am Woman's Rights, is actually one of those insertions, that went back and forth between them. Samuel had claimed Olivia tones down and almost stops talking at the word of command. And Olivia responds parenthetically, I deny it. I am women's rights, Livy. So, again, kind of a fun exchange back and forth. They seem to be very much in love. Let me see if I can just grab you one and then move on. This is 1872, so they're married pretty close to 2 years. She writes, my youth. She calls him youth. He calls her gravity. You have seemed so near and dear to me, if anything, more than unusually so since last evening. Clara and I got to talking of you, and I felt so rich in you and thankful for you. I could not help going to the tin box when I went to my room. It is never very safe for me to go there. That's the place where she kept all his love letters, in a green tin box. He's gone away, so she's going back to look at his letters. However, I did not read any of the oldest love letters, only some that were written since we were married, when you were in New York after the baby was born. How sweet the memory of all our love life is. Often when I get to thinking of you, I would like to have a good cry, a happy, thankful cry it would be. But at such times it is hard not to be able to put out my hand and touch you. Last night I had a vivid dream of your return, a natural dream. In my sleep I did all the things that I should have done waking if you had returned to me, put my hand in yours, stroked your hair, did everything that should make me really conscious of your presence. Youth, don't you think it is very sweet to love as we love? He was just so overwhelmed by her physicality. He says in his autobiography, he has an account where he says words to the effect that he was born reserved to endearments. He only saw his mother and father kiss once, and that was at a funeral, which is odd in and of itself right there. And he said that her affection broke on him like the waves on the Sea of Gibraltar, or some words to that effect. It's a very beautiful quote. And I think you can see that here as you listen to that excerpt. So they had one child born almost a year after they're married, or 9 months actually. He was born premature. And then another daughter is born in 1872. And shortly thereafter, after her birth, the firstborn son dies. I say all that very quickly, but it's a huge thing to go through, right? Marriage, premature early birth 9 months into your marriage, right? A sickly son, and then about 12 months later, a daughter is born, so 2 little children to manage, a husband who's traveling a lot, and the little boy does die of diphtheria. And, you know, we've had so much discussion about Clemens' grief at the passing of the little boy and theorizing about his death, but we never really had Olivia's voice, you know, as she loses her firstborn son. And so I'll just read a few excerpts from that. Seeing the mothers with their children does make me so homesick for Langdon. It seems as if I could not do without him. Molly, don't let that green box in the closet of the study be touched. It has the cast of Langdon's face in it. I think maybe we should go to the next photograph. I'm so sorry. So there's Langdon, the little baby who dies at 18 months. And she's talking about the cast, which was made of his face, you know, a death mask, and then a casting, which I believe is actually here in Elmira, in the art museum here in Elmira. And there's the daughter who was born too, Susie. So she's grieving the loss of Langdon in this letter, even as she has a newborn also. To her sister, she says, "Oh, I do want to see you. You certainly are the dearest little woman in the world. Oh, my little Susie," named after her older sister, Susan Langdon Crane, "does grow in grace and sweetness every day, and I am so thankful that her name is Susie. You would enjoy her. Now she coos and laughs and looks so wise. I do not know what I could do without her. She is such a comfort to me. I think her eyes may grow like Langdon's. They are lighter now than they were when we left home. Last night, I felt as if I must go and fix Langdon's grave, as if it was all I could do, and I longed to do that. He was so rarely beautiful. This house, where they're staying, is full of children, but there is none like him. I cannot help a bitter pang when I think how the child would reach to go from me. I think I was very weak to permit it. Sue, tell me about his little grave. I suppose what we want is 2 little stones, one for the head and one for the foot. Oh, how I loved him, yet how he always kept me at a distance. That frightful cold. I wonder if he could have stayed with us if it had not been for that. My little baby is such a comfort to me. Sue, do not think of me as always sad. I am not so. I have great comfort in those are left to me. Only I feel so often as if my pathway was to be from this time forth lined with graves. So, again, nice to have insight into her feelings after just always having Clemens's side of the story available to us. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide, which is Quarry Farm. So that, you might all recognize that slide, right? So these are a few letters written from Quarry Farm. Again, just excerpts here and there. By this time, she has 2 or 3 daughters, depending on, you know, which letter I'll read here to you. So she says, "Today I had baby all undressed, but her little undershirt. She said, 'Oh, if Susie sees me, she will say I am all legged.'" So she's quoting baby Clara there. "Tonight I was reading to her that ever-interesting story in Rollo. Little girl, you have left the gate open. And when I read about the rooster, I asked her if she would like to sleep up on a high pole. She said, 'No, for the world I wouldn't.' Once afterward, during our conversation, she used that expression, 'for the world.' I spoke about our riding on the clouds. They were so beautiful as we sat looking at them. She said in quite a fretful voice, 'There isn't any chair up there on the clouds.' Susie worked a long time today printing the letters to send to you. At first she seemed to think that she was going to print the entire letter to you in a few minutes. But after she found how difficult it was, she worked faithfully on it." Those are just little anecdotes she's sending to Samuel when he's gone. She writes to her sister-in-law from Quarry Farm, "We are here at the farm this summer. We are having a most delightful time. The children are well and happy and enjoy it so very much. They had chickens and ducks and pet the little calf. They grow as ragged and hardy looking as possible. Susie is just learning to read. I think Clara is going to learn much easier than Susie. She finds it rather hard work. They are both good, obedient little things. I expect to have pictures taken before very long, and I will send you one when I do. And she writes to Samuel about the children in Elmira. Youth, darling, we are all well and have had a most delightful Sunday. It would have been entirely perfect if you had been here. I made wreaths and crowns of goldenrod for the children this morning. This afternoon, Susie and I had a rather sad time because she told me a lie. She felt very unhappy about it. This evening, after her prayer, I prayed that she might be forgiven for it. Then I said, Susie, don't you want to pray about it and ask for yourself to be forgiven? She said, oh, one is enough. Oh, all right. Should we stop? How about this one? I think we'll go to the next photograph, which is a picture of the Hartford house. So here's some Hartford comments when she's down there running that enormous home. She says, I told Mr. Clemens the other day that in this day, women must be everything. They must keep up with all the current literature. They must know all about art. They must help in one or two benevolent societies. They must be perfect mothers. They must be perfect housekeepers and graceful, gracious hostesses. They must know how to give perfect dinners. They must go and visit all the people in the town where they live. They must always be ready to receive their acquaintances. They must dress themselves and their children becomingly. And above all, they must make their houses charming. And so on without end. Then, if they are not studying something, their case is a hopeless one. I don't know where to go. One more? One more. There's another one about housekeeping and mothering in that time period. It says, I'm getting on very well indeed, but mother, I don't believe you know what it is to set a house going that has stood empty for 18 months. They lived overseas and traveled for 18 months and left the house in Hartford empty, except for a servant or two. So she's writing her mother as she tries to get this huge place going again when they return. The pots and kettles are all rusty. The laundry chimney would not draw in fast. All the chimneys smoked clothes after they were washed, had to be taken over to Patrick's to be ironed. We could not remember where the servants' bedding was packed away. No dish towels, no tablecloths or china or silver unpacked. Everything, everywhere in confusion. I have felt a good many times during these days that if it were not for the children, I would give up housekeeping. But when I remember the sense of being taken care of, which I had both with you and at the farm this summer, I feel that I must give the same sense to my children. What an intense love of home I always had as a young lady. Now, surely, I ought to be able to do for my children what you did for me. I mean, maybe that's a place to stop. I'm sorry I can't go through them all, but you know, the rest of their life unfolds with some real difficulties and bankruptcies and really difficult times. And her voice changes with that, you know. So far, I think you've mostly heard the happy side of it all, but it's really quite interesting to see her change and mature and grieve and remain a steadfast believer in her husband, you know, and in his abilities despite overwhelming bankruptcy and everything falling apart. So the little Sammy in fairyland takes a dive. So we'll do a few questions?
Yeah,
or
thank you.